afternoon, everybody. Hi. So you are welcome to please continue enjoying your snacks. But as people filter in, I thought we would get going to be respectful of everybody's time. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Molly Stockdale. I'm the Executive Director of Travelers Rest Connection. Travelers Rest Connection merged with the Travelers Rest chapter of the Lucid Park Trail Heritage Foundation in 2021. That allows the chapter's mission to continue despite the pandemic, and it allows Travelers Rest Connection to be in a better relationship, a more formal relationship with the foundation. We are here today to learn about archaeology along the trail from some folks that I've had the pleasure of working with for a long time. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are gathered in the homeland of the Salish and Palisade people. We are committed to respectfully sharing the history and contemporary culture of the indigenous people who lived and traveled through this land. We learn from many indigenous artists, elders, and organizations. We invite you to learn from and support them as well. Our panel today includes Sara Scott. Sara earned her master's and PhD degrees in anthropology from the University of Oregon and the University of Montana, respectively. Sara worked for over 4 decades as an archaeologist for state and federal agencies, and recently retired as the Heritage Resources Program Manager for Montana State Parks. I have assumed the office that Sara moved out of because it has the best window at the park. Sara's research specialties include rock art, ancient trails, and stone tool analyses. Articles by Sara appear in Plains Anthropologist, the Journal of California and Great Basin Anthropology, the International Journal of Historic Archaeology, Archaeology in Montana, and we proceeded on. Sara teaches continuing education courses at the University of Montana on rock art and ancient trails. To Sara's left is Dan Hall. Dan has been involved with historic preservation and the study of Western history and prehistory for over 23 years. During this time, he has authored numerous reports on the prehistory and history of the Rocky Mountain West, the Columbia Plateau, and the Great Plains. He has worked on several projects involving resources associated with Lewis and Clark, military expeditions and military forts, homesteading, agriculture, mining, as well as a wide variety of prehistoric resources. He has supervised and conducted cultural resource surveys across Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, Colorado, Utah, and Washington. Mr. Hall has extensive experience with remote sensing applications, including investigations at Travelers Rest, Marysville, Fort Missoula, Lulu's gravesite, and Fort Benton, Montana, utilizing magnetometers, electromagnetic conductivity, electromagnetic resistivity, ground penetrating radar, metal detectors, and geochemical analysis. And finally, we have Loren Flynn. Loren served as the Executive Director of Travelers Rest Preservation and Heritage Association from 2002 to 2009, and from 2009 to 2019 as the Park Manager for the Bitterroot District of Montana State Park, which includes Travelers Rest. During that time, he was responsible for site and program development and day-to-day management of the Travelers Rest site. Since 2019, he has served as the Regional Recreation Manager for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, where he oversees recreation management at 10 state parks, 15 wildlife management areas, and 75 fishing access sites, as well as private lands public access programs. This is a great panel to talk to us about archaeology along the trail, and I ask you to join me in welcoming them.
Well, thank you, Molly, for that great introduction, and I want to thank the Trail Heritage Foundation for asking me to talk today, Dan and Loren as well. We're happy to be here to share the information that we know about. Before I get started, I just want to let you know that I am not a historian. I'm an archaeologist by trade, and what we do is look at the remains that people have left behind from 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, and we try and reconstruct the life way that those people had and lived. So it's a pretty different focus than what a historian would do. So I want to start out just expressing that. What I'll talk about today is I'll interchange the Buffalo Road with also the Lewis and Clark Trail because they're one and the same. And a lot of people wanted to walk in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark, but what you're going to do today is experience the archaeology of what Lewis and Clark walked through. So they're following well-worn trails, which they often refer to as roads. And those were the roads created by Indian people who have made treks on those trails for centuries. So I'll be talking about the Buffalo Road and the Indian people that used that road before Meriwether Lewis. Just to get a perspective, I know I saw the map upstairs, and a lot of you are from really far away places. So just to give you perspective, here's the Lewis and Clark Trail in red, and the purple circle is here in western Montana. The Buffalo Road is just outside Missoula, and some of you might go on the field trip tomorrow, and you'll see sections of the trail. More specifically, if you kind of drill down, this is the area that was surveyed. Here's the Buffalo Road Trail. It goes east from Missoula along the Blackfoot River. And then at Lincoln, which is about 75 miles from here, it heads north and east over the Continental Divide, which is a major dividing area between the Rocky Mountains and the plains of Montana. So let's all think back to 20 years ago, and I know most of you probably experienced the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. At the time, in the late 90s, I was working as an archaeologist for the Helena National Forest, and I was given the task, because the Bicentennial was coming up, Stephen Ambrose had just published his book, and there was really a great interest about Lewis and Clark, and you folks represent that. And federal land managers were really afraid that millions of people would come and want to walk in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark. And had they done that, they would destroy a lot of the resources that are located along the trail. So they wanted to make an effort to go out, discover what those resources are, look at Native American perspectives on Lewis and Clark, and then go forth so that they could protect the resources from the people that wanted to visit the trail. So I was tasked on the Helena Forest to go and do an on-the-ground survey of the trail that was just outside of Lincoln that I'll talk about today. Of course, before you go out and do your field work, you do a background literature search, you look at what's known about the area, what are the archaeological sites that might be found along the trail. And then also people wrote in historic times ethnographies about Indian people. What do they say about those people? So those are the kind of resources that you look at. And of course, Gary Bolton, his fabulous work that he did was so helpful on the Meriwether Lewis's trek along the Buffalo Road. And then also, we're looking at the whole perspective. So we wanted to know the resources out there. So we're also looking at what happened after Lewis and Clark walked down the Buffalo Road. And what we found was that the Buffalo Road, which is about 74 miles total from here in Missoula at the Clark Fork River all the way over Lewis and Clark Pass. And what we found is that it had been used for centuries, probably well over 1,000 years, based on the archaeological sites found along it. By the Salish, the Pend Oreille, the Nez Perce. It was really an important part of their seasonal round. They would make these treks down the trail along the Blackfoot River over the Continental Divide to hunt buffalo. And it's really striking. I mean, they're all living in the Rocky Mountains, and then you cross that Continental Divide, and it's the plains. And it was, I mean, Lewis and Clark even said they looked out on the plains, and all they could see was black because there were so many buffalo out there on the plains. So buffalo is a really important resource to Columbia Plateau Indian tribes. It provided buffalo robes. you could use the skins to make clothing, using the horn to make spoons. There were all sorts of things that you could make out of buffalo hide. And also, what was really important about it was that it was a trading commodity. All these different items that you could make from the buffalo, plus your food, you could trade with other people. And so once you had, you hunted buffalo, not only would that provide an abundance of food, because they're really big animals, as most of you know who have seen them in places like Yellowstone, but you could use the buffalo hides to make clothes, robes, parfleshes, bone beads, and as I mentioned, spoons out of horn. And then you could take these materials and then you could trade with tribes that are located further to the west near the Pacific Ocean. And they had salmon, which was a really huge commodity. And then also shells, which were really valued, and you can find those in archaeological sites. Dentalium on the top, and then olivella on the bottom. And then also these baskets, and then tule mats. I mean, so people use buffalo to trade for these kinds of things. So how did people hunt buffalo? So they crossed the Rocky Mountains at the Continental Divide, and they'd go out on the plains. Just incredible. Again, as I said, it's a whole different environment, drier, a lot more grass. Buffalo loved it. So initially, 5,000 years ago, people would herd buffalo into a draw, and then people would be ready to kill them along the sides of the draw, so they'd set them up, get them inside a draw, and then they were able to dispatch them there. And then later in time, like the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, people used buffalo jumps, and these were very strategically constructed because they would construct rock cairns that they would lead the buffalo along, and then the rock cairns would go to a cliff, and then the buffalo would go over the cliff where people were waiting to, if they were only injured, to kill them from there. So how did people, as they're moving along the trail, how did they travel? We used to say 1,700 people got horses, but now it's looking like people acquired horses much earlier. So up until about 1650, people would use dogs that would pull travois, and they would load their materials on the back of the travois. And then after about 1650, people would use horses, and horses can carry so much more than a dog. And so people could bring back way more buffalo, the hides, the meat, on their visits from the plains. And the way to think about this area, I don't have a little red stick to show you, but so we're talking about the Buffalo Road, which people have used, I believe, for 1,000 years, just based on the evidence that we find. But what you really need to see is that Montana was, at that time, say 1,000 years ago, just a corridor of trails that all interconnected. And people would travel along these trails, and at major confluences of rivers, they would get together, meet with other bands, meet with other tribes, and that was a place that they could trade information, find mates, and then also trade goods as well. So it's really not just one trail that goes along the Blackfoot River, it's many trails that were there at one point in time throughout Montana. And now, mostly all those trails are covered with roads and have been developed. So we've got Meriwether Lewis, heading out from Travelers Rest, which Dan Hall and Loren will talk about. But so he heads out from Travelers Rest. He's got 9 men with him, 5 Nez Perce guides, 17 horses, and he heads out from Travelers Rest and gets to the area of Missoula, a little bit to the east of us, to where the Clark Fork and the Blackfoot River converge, and his Nez Perce guides say that they can't go any further with them, and warn them that you guys are going to be cut off by enemy tribes, and they didn't want to go, and they told Meriwether Lewis that he was definitely some bad things were going to happen. So I think Meriwether Lewis, he talks about in his journal, he was on guard both day and night because he knew they were in the territory of enemy people. And he also had a lot of concern over splitting up with William Clark, going to the Yellowstone, and Meriwether Lewis and his group going a whole nother way. So as they're traveling along the Blackfoot River, he talks about how horrible the mosquitoes were, as I try and set the stage for what this looked like. And that at night, their horses were so bothered by the mosquitoes that the horses would literally stand in the fire, just trying to get them off their neck and out of their eyes. But one of the interesting things that he talks about as he moves through the Blackfoot River is a number of abandoned Indian camps that he's observing. And for an archaeologist, this is such a gold mine. So he's walking in this roughly 70-mile area, and he observes just right along the trail 5 different Indian camps, and ranging with the number of brush and bark structures from 11 all the way to 32 as he's getting closer to the Continental Divide. So that was just such a great mine to see. So it really does show the number of American Indian people that were moving up and down the trail. And of course, that was a time when people had horses, because it's in 1806. So not only is it people traveling from this side of the divide over the Continental Divide, but it's also Plains tribes coming over to raid Salish Indian tribes here to steal their horses and other things from them. So, and guns, horses, so that was pretty common. And in fact, Lewis talks about that, as they're moving along the trail, he sees all these different horse tracks, and he knows that there was a group of probably Crow that went over to raid the Salish, and then they're making off, beating feet back over to the other side of the divide. So here's the Alice Creek drainage, which they walk down the Blackfoot River, and then they hit Alice Creek, and where they cross the Continental Divide. And you can see, this is the Rocky Mountains. It's heavily forested. There's some sagebrush at the bottom, but it's a pretty forested environment. And one side is looking up. Let's see, this would be on your left side. That's looking up toward the Continental Divide, and on the right, that's from the top of the Continental Divide looking out. And they reached this area on July 7th, 1806. And from the top of Lewis and Clark Pass, you can look at it, you can see just the starkly different environment that the plains represent. It's night and day between the Rocky Mountains and the plains. You could see why bison love the plains so much, particularly when it's really good years for grass. So when they get to the top of the pass, Lewis says he sees Ford Mountain in the distance, and that was something that he had named in 1805 when they were heading out to the Pacific Ocean. So they were all thrilled to be back in familiar territory once again, and also the men that were in his party rejoiced because they were also back in Buffalo country. So from here, they went on to the Great Falls of Missouri, and that's out of the area that we studied. But this is where the story kind of ends for me, is at the top of Lewis and Clark Pass, because that's the area that was in the National Forest land that we looked at. So after Meriwether Lewis and his party went through the Blackfoot area, it continued to be heavily used by Indian people, and as I said, it became a lot of Plains tribes coming over to raid Salish and Nez Perce tribes on this side of the Continental Divide. And so a lot of it was horse raiding and warfare along the trail, not just kind of a transhumance over and coming back with goods and food. And then in the 1840s, missionaries were in this area, Nicholas Point, and then also Father de Smet. And Nicholas Point in the 1840s traveled with Salish Indians on the road to the Buffalo Trail over the Continental Divide. And many of the trips were 30-plus day trips. And he recorded what their customs were, the kind of things they did, how friendly they were to other people, and how he stressed how important buffalo were to the Salish, not only again for food, but also for as trading items. And then by the 1850s, people were looking for a railroad that would go through the area, also military roads, so people are starting to move through the area, many more Caucasian, European people. And then in 1865, in Lincoln, gold was discovered, and then suddenly the population of Lincoln, I'm not sure what the population is today, but I'm guessing it's well under 1,000. But by 1871, 3,000 people were there. So the whole tenor of the trail is really starting to change. And with all those people, our people are bringing in wagon trains, and they're starting to use the Buffalo Road. So it becomes a stage road rather than a trail used by Native American people. And then finally, by the late 1800s, ranching, mining start to develop. And in fact, up near Lewis and Clark Pass, there was a homestead that was developed up there. And in the early 1900s, the woman, Alberta Patterson, who owned the homestead, she was out picking service berries, and she heard all this rumbling, and she hid in the bushes, and people came, Indian people were coming from the west side and then heading on the trail over the Continental Divide. So with travois, and it was a large group of people. So people, even in the 1900s, they were potentially going to trade or hunting elk, one or the other, I'm not sure. But so Indian people were still using the trail then. So let's, back to the original, the survey of the area, just to show you the map again of where the area we're looking at. So we did an on-the-ground survey of Lewis and Clark Pass. It's just a 5-mile area, but in that slide that I showed you, looking up toward Lewis and Clark Pass, that was the area that we were surveying. And in terms of where we would look for the Buffalo Road Trail, Bob Bergantino, who's a professor at Montana Tech, he's retired now, but he spent 30 years trying to figure out exactly where Lewis and Clark went. And then he plotted the route on topographic maps, and then these are over in the Historical Society over in Helena. So that was really helpful. Before we even went out, we had the map showing where the trail, he suspected the trail went. So we did the field survey looking where we thought the trail alignment was, looking 1,000 feet on either side of that area to just see what we might find in those areas. And then here is a map showing that was the result of the survey that we did. And I know this is a little hard to see, but any place that you see a dot or a symbol or the gray areas, those are archaeological sites. Those are features that we found along that 5-mile segment of the trail. And the trail is just shown in dotted lines. There still were travois tracks visible then. This was 20 years ago. And now when you go out there, there's been a fire there. It looks a little bit different. So one of the main things that we were looking for is trail tread, and were the original tracks of Lewis and Clark and Indian people out there on the ground. And as I showed you, there was probably about 3 miles of the trail that was still intact. And how do you find a trail? It's hard to know, is this something that was historic? Is this something that is 1,000 years old? All those questions are hard to answer. But a lot of people ask, so how do you know that it's not a game trail? Well, game trails, as many of you have seen, they go straight up the hill. Whereas human-use trails follow the contour of the hillside. And so we found the trail up on the hillside, and also a lot of the trails were braided, so there isn't just one. Many of these groups of Indian people were traveling with, say, 100 people, and so they're not all going to go single file. They're going to go in different areas of the trail, but they're going to traverse the hillside, not go up and down. And also, we found that there were places where trees were growing in a row, and those were growing in the old trail bed. And here's a picture of the 2 people surveying the area, and we're standing in this old roadbed, which I showed this to some of my Forest Service cohorts who said, oh, well, that's an old road. And that's exactly the point. What Meriwether Lewis was following was an established road, and of course that's no longer used now. But you can see it's really obvious, and it definitely was a road beaten down by centuries of Indian travel. We also found 5 scarred trees, and these, one of the, William Clark in 1805, as they were traveling toward the Pacific Ocean, Sacagawea told him they found a scarred tree, and she said, my Shoshone people do that, and we pull back the bark in the spring when sap is really flowing, and we eat that inner cambium layer. So we found scarred trees along the trail. And then there was an abundance, 10 rock cairns, and there's a lot of discussion among archaeologists. What do these rock cairns represent? Are they trail markers? What specifically are they? And so we found 10 of these rock piles, and we looked at, in the background literature search that we had done, we looked at, there was a place called the Bad Pass Trail in Wyoming where 170 rock cairns were discovered. And there they excavated 16 of those rock cairns, and what they found inside of them were pieces of chipstone tools, pottery, juniper, charcoal. So it seems like there is the interpretation that people were using a lot of these rock cairns as mini altars that were out there on the landscape. And in fact, when the group was coming to Travelers Rest in 1806 with their Nez Perce guides, the Nez Perce guides asked at a big rock cairn that had been built, they asked for a halt and they wanted to stop and smoke a pipe. So it's possible that rock cairns served more of just an offering place, and also as a place where people could pile rocks to get out of the way of the Indian horses that were pulling the travois. You don't want those to fall over or be tipped over by a rock. One of the rock cairns that they found a piece of charcoal on the Bad Pass Trail. They radiocarbon dated that, and it dated to the year 300. So it's 1,700 years old, showing that people have been following these trails for thousands of years. And another interesting feature that we found were these were looked like they could have been collapsed rock cairns, but the stones were much larger and there were way more of them, and there were 2 of them. And interestingly, when we did consultations with the Salish and Pend Oreille tribes, and they said that their traditional name for Lewis and Clark Pass was Stone Fort Pass, place where warriors would sit in small stone structures to watch for approaching Blackfeet raiders. So, it's really interesting that that was a really helpful interpretation, oral history interpretation, about the possible function of these 2 features that we found out on the landscape. And kind of lastly, in terms of stone features, there was a stone cross that was just on one side of the Buffalo Road Pass there. And a lot of the Forest Service people I was working with said, sheep herders were up there in the early 1900s. I'm sure that's probably a sheep herder died and somebody built a cross over his grave. But in looking at different references, we found a reference from Nicholas Point, who was the missionary that traveled in 1842 with the Salish, and we found a reference of him making and planting a cross in a place where he could see forever, and that he did this as a way of conveying his Christian religion and in hopes of converting Indian tribes to Christian religion, but also as a means for protection because they were about ready to enter Blackfeet country. And I'm not sure if this specifically relates to Lewis and Clark Pass, but it's one line of evidence, but we also have another line of evidence that shows that the cross dates to around the 1840s, mid-1840s. So once we were done with the survey, we had all these different stone features. And as I mentioned, as an archaeologist, what we're wanting to do is build a chronology over time. What happened first? How were people living? What happens next? How did things change? And so we had all these stone features, the cross, the rock cairns, the stone forts, and we were really curious. So what is the time frame for any of these features, which is such a pressing question for us? And so enter Dan Hall. Dan Hall was hired to write a National Register nomination of all the resources that were found in this 5-mile segment. And he did that and prepared a National Register Historic District nomination for that area. But he was perplexed by the same thing, and so he came up with the idea to look at the Lincoln Cemetery. As I mentioned, that was founded early for mining, and he found a headstone of Minnie Neal, who died in 1869, and it had a couple different species of lichen growing on it. So he took measurements from that, and then that helps give you a growth rate for how fast lichen grow. And then he used that to look at the stone features up on top of Lewis and Clark Pass. And you can see here, I mean, this was just so profound. I love that you did this study. So there were 2 different species that were used, but you can see, like at the top with the stone forts, look at the dates that come up. 1344, like that's a long time ago in terms of people traveling over the pass, and then up to 1655, and that's about when it stops. But some of the rock cairns, one of the dates, 1767, so people, you know, traveling the trail, putting rocks in a pile, let's see what okay. Yeah, so it was really helpful for us to kind of help establish a date. And the stone cross, there you can see, like 5 different measurements were taken, and those measurements averaged to 1847. And Nicholas Point was in there in 1842. So that might be another line of evidence that suggests that stone cross is associated with Nicholas Point. So once the survey was done, first off, before Dan prepared the National Register nomination, I wrote a historic preservation plan for the Helena Forest so that land managers there could look at what was out on the ground, and I recommended ways that they could help protect the resources on the ground from the onslaught of people that we thought would be coming for the bicentennial. It never really happened to the degree that we thought. It wasn't millions of people, but it was large groups of people. And then after that, we did hire Dan to do the National Register nomination, which leaves a lasting legacy for the bicentennial, but also for the Indian people who use the trail. So in terms of the interpretation of the trail, it's the perfect cultural landscape. And by cultural landscape, meaning you've got one area, but that it shows uses through time of a bunch of different people. And in the beginning, you've got, it's a travel route over to the plains so people can hunt buffalo. And then later, you've got trade, you've got warfare going on in the 1800s up until probably about 1880. And then after that, Meriwether Lewis comes through, and then people are exploring it for a railroad, for military roads. And then after that, we've got mining and homesteading and ranching coming in. And so these are the different uses for the road. So it started out as an Indian trail, and then right now, you guys that do the field trip tomorrow, you'll be driving on Highway 200, which now takes the place of the Buffalo Road. So all of this information, as Molly mentioned, it was just published in the May issue of We Proceeded On. I kept trying to get the cover of We Proceeded On as a slide, but I would insert it, and then it would turn sideways or upside down. So I just decided to abandon that. But a really detailed version of this study was published in the International Journal of Historic Archaeology. And with that, I really appreciate your attention and for giving me the opportunity to tell you about the Buffalo Road. And I want to hand it over to Dan Hall.
Dan, you got to come back and follow here, buddy.
I do.
And I think our plan for today was to, all of us will speak, and then we'll have time left over for questions for any of us.
That article and proceed on.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Is there a teenager in there? Let's spend today and talk a little bit about the groups and the organizations that played a role in our work at Travelers Rest. Instead of the normal presentation that I give on the archaeology, and this occurred to me because so many of my project team, they've departed and they're no longer with us. And I think it's time we tell their story and their involvement and the things that they did. There were so many institutions and so many organizations and so many people that were part of this project. All I did was just assemble a group of people and then turn them loose to do what they do best. And this story begins with the Travelers Rest chapter of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. This is their story. They did this. And I will always be eternally grateful to them for what they did. Their curiosity and their drive and their passion for all things Lewis and Clark is really truly something to behold. And you can see the list here of these are the project sponsors, the people that we worked with. It's quite extensive. There was help and assistance from just about every corner that you can possibly imagine. Again, back to the chapter. They, like most of your members of chapters, they would begin their meetings with a reading of the Bible. And with the introduction of the Molten edition of the journals, there's information that had never been available before. And as they're reading through the journals, there was one passage that had never been published before that struck them. And Meriwether Lewis talked about when they left Travelers Rest, they struck camp, they went down the creek to the Native American Trail where they forded the creek before they struck north towards present-day Missouri. Well, Travelers Rest had always been recorded as a confluence of the creek and the river. And as they're reading this one passage, they dawned on them that the Travelers Rest site is not where they think it is. And so they began to question where actually was the Travelers Rest site. And to their credit, they took this on. They did two things at the same time. And I have not told this before, but I'll cop to it now. Tony Vasey knocked on my door and very politely asked if I would consider this project. How would you find Lewis and Clark? How would you find Travelers Rest site? And I told him no. I said, I'm not going to do this. I knew what he was asking, and I told him, I said, there's got to be an agency archaeologist somewhere that will do this. A month later, he came and knocked on my door again, and I said, okay, I'll do this. The chapter, they did two things. They approached Bob Bergantino, and as Sara had said, Bob was at Montana Tech, and he was very meticulous in his work. And so they went to Bob and they said, okay, where would you place Travelers Rest? And so Bob looks at the courses and distances and record the celestial observations. And he draws a circle on a map and he says, I believe this is where the site is more accurately located. And I approach this from a completely different point of view. And that the expedition following a Native American guide on a Native American trail would have stayed at the Native American campsite. So you look for evidence of a Native American campsite. Somewhere in there you're going to find Lewis and Clark. And to that end, I took a series of aerial infrared photographs on a flat line over Lolo Creek. And lo and behold, these teepee rings started to appear. So we went and knocked on doors up and down the creek and started talking to the landowners. and asking if they had ever seen any evidence of Native American use of the area. And lo and behold, this is a really large ancient site. And so I draw a circle on a map, and I said, somewhere in here is probably the location of the campsite. And Bob Bergantino and I appear at a chapter meeting with a presentation, and lo and behold, we're pointing to the same patch of ground. And this is good science. This is how science is supposed to work. You have two different researchers approaching the same question from two different points of view, and they come to the same conclusion. And it seemed to us a no-brainer that the Park Service should move that designation from the confluence of the creek and the river 1.5 miles upstream. Little did we know what we were in for. This is where Missoula County gets involved, and Missoula County really deserves a big credit for what they did. Alan Matthews was the city county historic preservation officer at the time. Tim Hall was the rural planner for Missoula County. He was working with Lolo at the time, and they recognized that this was something that had to be dealt with in terms of the growth that Lolo was going through. It was also important from a historic preservation point of view. There were subdivisions slated for part of the property. So Alan and Tim went to Atlanta, Georgia, and they met with the National Park Service. Travelers Rest is a National Historic Landmark. The National Historic Landmark Program was having their annual meeting in Atlanta. And Alan and Tim walked in and they say, hey, we think you have Travelers Rest located in the wrong location. And the Park Service says, well, okay, we're going to need more information. We agree that this probably is the wrong location, but you're going to need more. They've never done this before. We moved a National Historic Landmark designation. And to the Park Service's credit, they really stepped up. They asked for this to be done, and they participated fully in so many different ways. The archaeologist staff at Fort Clatsop, the Midwest Archaeological Research Center in Omaha, the National Historic Landmark Program in Denver, Colorado. So many different agencies from within the Park Service stepped up to help. The next thing that happened was Alan Matthews reached out to the regional office of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I can't sing the praises enough of the National Trust. This is what they do. They save the threatened and endangered historic sites. This particular year in Montana, Travelers Rest, Going to the Sun Road, and Virginia City were all on their annual list of the most endangered sites in the United States. There are 10 sites every year, and 3 of them were in Montana. Richard Moe, the president of the trust, came out to see all 3 of the sites. This is Richard in the center. And I'd like to say that when the president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation comes to Lolo, Montana, good things happen. He travels in a different world than we do, and he brought his friends to bear on this. He introduced us to the White House, to the Save America's Treasure program. So many different funding sources to help. And then, of course, I don't think this would have happened without their involvement. This picture that you see here on the left, that's Barb Paul. On the left, County Commissioner Bill Carey on the right, and Richard Moe is in the center, and the rest of this is National Park Service staff and Missoula County staff. And this really, truly was an amazing opportunity. And I want to take a moment and talk about the Native American involvement. And I don't want to call this consultation because that's not what it was. I think it's important to understand that this is not something they celebrate. This is not discovery. This is the beginning of the end to them. When we first started talking to the tribes, they didn't want to talk with us. Our former Congressman Pat Williams had spent decades working with the tribes in various capacities, and he had established a good relationship with them. And Pat took this on himself to start the conversation with the tribes and to hold regular meetings. And in the beginning, they were not very successful. On a funny personal note, we had a number of meetings that just were not working well at all. My wife had just gone back to work after giving birth to our son, and I'm schlepping the kid everywhere. And I brought him to a meeting. Bruce obviously knows what this is about. I arrived at the meeting, and the kid needs a diaper, and he's hungry, and I get him changed. I'm trying to feed him, and it's not working. And the elders are looking at me, and they look at the baby, and they just grab the kid, and they get him fed, they get him birth, and they're playing with the baby. And it was the most amazing productive meeting we ever had. After the meeting's over, Pat turns to me and says, "Bring that kid to the next one."
What year was that?
That would have been 1998. The meetings with the tribes culminated with a meeting at the Longhouse in St. Ignatius. The elders have a place where they meet, and it is a longhouse. This meeting was attended by the University of Montana, by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, by the Travelers Rest Chapter, National Park Service. Pat Williams pulled this together for us. All three Missoula County Commissioners were there. And the elders were so pleased that so many people had come to hear them and to listen to what they had to say. And that really was the seminal breakthrough in our conversations with the tribes. I've been involved in this field for 40 years, and this is probably one of the most poignant meetings I've ever been involved with the tribal elders. It really, truly was amazing. And it really opened up the door, and I really hope that that plays a big role in why there's such a good rapport now with the site and the tribes. What the tribes asked us to do was to include a soil scientist on our project team. They asked that they could have a tribal monitor that would be on site when we were doing excavation. And they asked that if we found anything that we weren't really sure if it was Native American or Euro-American, that they be involved. And so we readily agreed to all this. And I would note, at this point in time, we already had our methodology lined out. We already had our budget lined out. Stephen Ambrose stepped in and wrote a check out of his pocket to pay for the geoarchaeologists. The gentleman we brought in was from Salt Lake City. He's one of the leading geoarchaeologists in the United States. And his work was really useful to us. It helped us to interpret the landform. It helped us to identify things that were clearly Euro-American. It helped us to identify things that were clearly Native American. And to that end, as an example, we had done remote sensing with a magnetometer over the area where we found the compact button. And on the right-hand side of the image here, you're seeing that there's an underground power line. We actually tried to clip that so it wouldn't interfere with our image. But there were some other things that we wanted to see here. We already found 2 fire hearts. We're trying to find the third. This would replicate the results of what the archaeologists were reporting from the Portage site in Great Falls. And so we're looking for a third fire heart. And up in the upper left-hand corner there are some magnetic anomalies where you have a blue and a red that are sitting right next to each other. It's called a dipolar magnetic anomaly. And that's typically indicates that there's a fire heart there. So we open up an excavation, we drop down, and yes, there is a fire heart there. At this point, we realize it's a little deeper than the ones we had found previously. We pulled a piece of charcoal off of the hearth. We contacted the tribes. We sent the charcoal off to be dated to a carbon-14 lab. And the date came back, I believe, 900 plus or minus 50 years. And so this clearly was a Native American fire. But now we're also in that area where Bill had told us that we'd be transitioning into the Native American site. And so we filled up that excavation and we didn't explore it in its entirety. There were other magnetic anomalies there we wanted to look at, but out of respect for the tribes and what they were concerned about, we just kind of walked away from that part of the site. We felt there's really no need to go there and excavate that. It's not going to answer the question of where Lewis and Clark. As I said, we did a lot of remote sensing on this project. Steve DeMoore is the godfather of remote sensing and archaeology in the United States. He's with the Midwest Archaeological Research Center in Omaha. Steve was here on numerous occasions for meetings. He met with the tribes, he met with the public, with the local landowners, and the Travelers Rest chapter was there for every one of those meetings. There was a lot of work that had to be done in association with the magnetic work, and the chapter did this. This is a working ranch. There are irrigation pipes, there are fences. The old channel of Lower Creek had equipment, farm equipment, and trash in it that had to be removed. There was quite a bit of work that had to be done before we could even begin the study itself. And the chapter stepped up and did this. And again, I can't thank them enough. Some of the other support we got was from the University of Montana. George Dennison was the president of the university at the time. George came out of the history department, and he made it very clear, campus-wide, that we were to be given all this institutional support that they could offer. And the geology department, the history department, the anthropology departments all stepped up in a major way to help. And we couldn't have done this without their support in so many different ways. The geology department in particular, and I don't say this because I'm alone with that department, but they had the toys. And they had students that wanted to use these in a real-world application. I think the discovery of the latrine is probably one of those examples where it's just pure serendipity. We wanted to work in the area where the Tomback button had been recovered, but the EM31, it's a toy that measures how electrical current passes through the soil. But it was so sensitive, there's overhead power lines and overhead phone lines. The equipment would not normalize and it couldn't work. And so I told Noel and Steve, just go down to that end of the project area and start collecting data, and then we'll come back out in the center, we'll leapfrog each other, and we can resume our normal methodology that we wanted to proceed with. Very first data set where they started collecting information, they're like, hey, we've got something here. What they found was someone had dug a trench and they had put something in it. At this point, we don't know what it is. We brought the magnetometer over, and when the soils are laid down, they will orient themselves to whatever is magnetic north at the time. And then as we come through and we disturb that soil, we disturb that orientation of those iron sulfide particles. So we knew that someone had dug a trench. This was non-metallic, where there was no historic artifacts associated with it. That's really about all we knew. At this point in time, back to the Park Service and people at Fort Clatsop. People at Fort Clatsop had pioneered this technique. They were searching for the latrine there at Fort Clatsop. And the idea is the mercury that was in Dr. Rush's pills, as you know, they were called thunderclappers for a reason. They had tried this technique at Fort Clatsop and they had failed. What they found was that there was a pulp mill in the vicinity. The pulp mills, they leave traces of mercury everywhere. It just comes out the smokestack. But they were really encouraged and helpful with us with our investigation. They provided us with the results of their study. They came over and met with us. We talked about methodology for this study. We then went over to the geology department, met with Dr. Nancy Hinman and taught geochemistry. And we came up with a methodology, if you will. We needed to sample from across the landform. We needed to sample at the surface. We needed to sample at depth. And we needed to sample as we were excavating this feature that we found with the remote sensing. The photograph on the left here is the first excavation unit we opened up. And this is the latrine, if you will. And if you spend as much time as I have excavating historic sites in Montana, it's a singularly unique deposit. You know what you're putting your fingers into when you're excavating the latrine. The image on the right, these are the locations where we sampled the mercury. We did mercury vapor analysis. One of the characteristics of mercury that makes it so easy to detect is the vapor barrier pressure point. It transfers from a solid state or liquid state into a vapor. And searching for that vapor is one of the keys. We also collected samples and sent them to a laboratory in Billings, where they processed the mercury, or the soil, I should say, searching for the mercury. We did samples in duplicates and triplicates. The image shows the soil profile, and as we excavated along, the only place that we found mercury in the entire investigation was at the bottom of the soil feature. We didn't find, we had hundreds and hundreds of samples. We sent samples to, like I said, to Billings. Of all of the evidence that we found, I think this is probably the one that could stand by itself. There was a blue trade bead that had been found. Blue trade beads are, at the time, were a hot commodity. If that's all the evidence you would have a hard time saying this is the Lewis and Clark campsite. There was a piece of lead that we had found. And again, if that was the only piece of lead, if that was the only artifact you would have a hard time making the argument that this is indeed this campsite. Well, the terrain is different. This could stand on its own. This really, I think, is probably the definitive proof of where the campsite was. And again, back to the university, the National Park Service, their assistance was key. And I do want to talk about the history department. They opened up so many doors. We wrote a chapter on the military aspects of the expedition. And at that point in time, not a lot of people had done research into that avenue. And we felt kind of awkward about it. The history department, Dr. Kim Lockridge introduced us to his colleagues who were military historians at Michigan and at Yale. And they pointed us to sources and resources to look at and read. They gave them their time freely. And of course, I need to acknowledge Stephen Ambrose. Watching him walk around the campsite was like watching a kid in a candy shop. He truly was just beside himself. He was so excited. As I said, he not only got his checkbook and wrote a check, but he said, call me anytime if you have any questions at all. And there were numerous times where I thought, the guy's going to get really tired of this. But he didn't. And he always answered our questions. And if he couldn't answer them, he would point us directly to someone who could help. I will always be grateful to Dr. Ambrose for everything that he did for this project. He truly was a joy to work with. And he really had the passion for the Lewis and Clark trails. And watching him interact with the members of the Travelers Rest chapter was, that was a lot of fun. It really, truly was amazing. So to bring this back home, this is the story of the Travelers Rest chapter. On the upper right is Bruce Truitt. The day we found the compact button, this property was slated for subdivision, and the property owner allowed us an opportunity to go out there and search before the subdivision occurred. Now Bruce pulls this button out of the ground. There are no known examples of uniforms that the expedition wore. We know that this button is of the time period, and it was worn by the military. But buttons are also Native American trade goods. And so again, back to if this was the only piece of evidence you had, it would be hard to say that this is evidence. But when you add that to the presence of the lead, and to the trade bead, and to what Bob said, and the aerial infrared photographs, and to the train, we build a case based on the preponderance of evidence that this is the location. The photo on the left on the top, the gentleman by the name of Jack Fisher. Jack was a member of the chapter. Jack passed a few years ago. He was a personal friend of mine. Jack had retired after a long career with the Forest Service. And Milo McLeod was the Lowell Forest archaeologist. And Milo turned him into a junkie. Jack would volunteer for archaeological excavations all over the United States. And this is how he spent his retirement. And so Jack, as a member of the chapter, he shows up. We had to demonstrate to the National Park Service that there was a public interest in this project. And so we allowed for members of the chapter to participate for a week in the excavations. And I told Jack, you are free to come and go as you please. You can come for any or all of it. And he was there every day, without fail. At one point in time, we were searching for the central fire hearth, and we couldn't find it. We had surmised that the expedition would be on the banks of Lolo Creek, and they would have a fire that would burn incredibly hot and would be incredibly small. And this would be the gunsmithing repair activity that had occurred. And it's not going to look like a normal campfire. We had this, you saw the image earlier, you probably seen it down at the site. This magnetic anomaly was just like nothing we had ever seen. And we had spent quite a bit of time excavating, trying to find the fire hearth, and we couldn't. We huddled up with the National Park Service, with Steve Ward from the West Archaeological Research Center, with Steve Sheriff with the University of Montana. And we're like, okay, well, what are we doing wrong here? And the consensus was that the fire hearth was really small, and we just had to keep looking. So I went back out to the site, and I turned to Jack, and I said, all right, you're the quartermaster. Where would you find, where would you put that fire? And Jack looks around, drops his shovel, and he says, right here. We opened up the excavation, there it was. And I think Jack really typified the Travelers Rest chapter. They did so much. Their passion for the Lewis and Clark Trail, their understanding of what this meant and what it meant for future generations, I think was truly outstanding. It was a pleasure to work with them. I would do it again in a heartbeat. And as I said earlier, I haven't told anybody I first told them no. But I'm telling that today, and I made a mistake. I most certainly would work with them anytime, anywhere, any place. And I think that's a testament to that organization, those people at that point in time. Thank you.
Let's see if this works. All right. So while I'm pulling up my program here, I want to tell a story about Dan Hall. And so I started at Travelers Rest, started working there in the spring of 2002, just a couple of months before Dan and his group went to work on the excavation. And I was sitting in my office one July afternoon when and the office was closed, but it was late in the afternoon, and the office was in an old farmhouse, and there was a pounding on the door, and I looked up, and Dan was at the window. I think his beard was even bigger then, and all I could see was beard and teeth because he was smiling so broadly. And that was the day that they discovered the latrine. So it's really a pleasure to be with you here today. And as I was thinking about it, you're going to be out at Travelers Rest tomorrow, right, for dinner. And I'm sure you're aware of the significance of that date, June 30th. 1806, and June 30th is when they returned to Travelers Rest. So I'm going to talk a little bit about when Dan's work was done, and the site is now established as a state park. What do we do with it, and how do we go about that? And so to set the stage just a little bit, I was hired not by Montana State Parks, but by the group, the Travelers Rest Preservation and Heritage Association, which is a nonprofit organization, which is now who Molly works for. So I was Molly before Molly. And we were tasked with the management, the interpretation, the preservation, and the development of this state park. So raising all the money, taking on that responsibility. And when I came in the spring of 2002, the park wasn't open to the public, and we didn't have even a concept of what was going to happen. So over the course of the next few months, we pulled together stakeholders and the community and partners, and we put together a conceptual plan for what we plan to do at Travel Trust State Park. But what I found out in doing that was that, this is 2002, and the bicentennial celebration nationally started in January of 2003. And by the time we had a conceptual plan put together, even before I walked in the door, most of the dollars to do development, whether it was programmatic or site development or whatever, nationally, those dollars had already been allocated. There wasn't, we couldn't find, it was hard to find a couple $1,000s to do some of this stuff. So what that did though, and I think we would have probably taken a similar approach anyway, but rather than focus on the bicentennial, we started thinking about how do we do something that's relevant and sustainable. And I know it's hard to believe, but outside of this room, the segment of the population that's really into Lewis and Clark is a pretty narrow segment of the population. Hard for you guys to believe, I know. But what that did is it kind of changed our focus. It's like, okay, yes, as Sara mentioned, all of these people are going to come to the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. But what do we do when that's gone? What do we do to kind of make sure that this story continues on? And so I think that put us into a place where we started to look at what are the real bedrocks of what we do here. And obviously Lewis and Clark is a significant part of that. But what Dan's work and the validation and the verification of the site, that created for us a very unique, a one-of-a-kind opportunity. Right? There's only one place in the country where we can say we know where they can, exactly where they can. We have the evidence of that. So let's focus on that. And by doing so, that makes us unique. And we became experts on telling the story of Lewis and Clark and Travel Trust, Lewis and Clark in the Bitterroot Valley, Lewis and Clark crossing the Bitterroot Mountains. That was our focus. I would tell seasonal staff, yeah, of course you should know a little bit about Let's see if that works. Okay. So we became experts on that. The other thing that allowed us to do is it made us a unique site. And it allowed us then to think about how we interpreted Lewis and Clark. And the programming that we did, we tried to make sure that we were looking at the broad spectrum of everything we did. If you think about, not only can we talk about archaeology and travel, but using the celestial observation, so you have navigation and things like that. So it really opened up a lot of these things that we could do, that we could really become focused on and not try to tell the entire story, but tell that story extremely well. And we've already heard mention of the Native American component here. And leading up to the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial, it seemed like there was a lot of discussion about involving Native American perspectives in the Bicentennial. But it was oftentimes, it seemed to me, about, well, tell us about how Lewis and Clark affected you, rather than looking at the rich history of these people that have been in these places from time immemorial. And so there was a little bit different approach that we took to that I think that served us well. And that was that we approached it in a true collaborative fashion. And what we wanted to provide was a platform where their stories and their history could be told in an unedited version, where we weren't the ones dictating what they should be speaking about. And so you see this picture here of Stephen Smallsalmon, who's been a tremendous presenter at the park. And I think about others like the late Tony and Cashola and late Louis Adams but people like Tim Ryan and Bernard Montier, who have just been so wonderful to us. But again, even though this is a great crossroads, this is a place where people have been traveling and trading for thousands of years, but we were in the homeland of the Bitter and Salish. And so focusing on that local, place-based story really seemed to serve us well. And so even though we've had collaboration with other tribes, it is the Salish and the Salish Culture Committee who we continually go back to and collaborate with in our program. And again, that helped us reach a larger audience and remain relevant as we move forward. And then each of these stories, the Lewis and Clark story and the Native American story, the Salish story, were intertwined with the natural world. They relied on that for food and clothing and shelter and medicine. And they battled the wind and the heat and the snow and the rain and the mosquitoes as many different ways as you wanted to spell it. They battled all of those. And so that intersects and then weaves apart and then comes back together again. And we, over time, acquired some additional land. We originally started with just 15 acres, and now the park's up to about 65 acres. And it's bisected by Willow Creek, and it's a beautiful setting to be able to kind of to learn and teach about the natural world. And then one of the biggest challenges we face, and this is true of historic sites across the country, it's really difficult for historic sites to be relevant to their local communities. You know, if I went to Pennsylvania, I might drive across the state to go to Gettysburg, but I might not drive down the street to the local historic site. Or I've been there once and I know that story. I don't need to go back again, right? It's history, it doesn't change, right? So how do we get to be relevant to the local community? Because that was so important. We're nestled right into that community. So you have to look for different ways to tell our story. It has to be dynamic and changing. You're still telling that story to be consistent. But one of the things that's beautiful about doing it that way is if you have relatives that come into town and you haven't been there for a year or two, and you take them down there, and you get a little bit different experience. It's fresh again. It's something different. The other thing we did is we made sure that as the park developed, that we became a part of that community. Our park trails, as we developed them, went into neighborhoods, connected to other trails that were around the park. We invited the public in to come in to go for their evening stroll. Mothers pushing their kids in strollers on the park trails. Come in to go fishing in the creek. We encourage that kind of use to come in, and in the process, we're a little surreptitious, right? We're going to make sure you get a little bit of this story about Lewis and Clark, or the Salish people. You're going to get that in our signage, and we're going to keep changing that and making it fresh. And again, that allowed us to connect to a larger audience. And then one of the things that I think is a little bit fascinating, and it certainly wasn't by design, although I was very aware of it as we went through it. As Dan said, you know, this was a National Historic Landmark, and you never did say that they actually did move it. They did move the landmark, and it's now a traveler trust. And so it would not be out of line for the National Park Service to manage this site because it's a National Historic Landmark. And if the National Park Service had managed the site, there would have been years of master planning that had gone in. There would have been a site plan and an interpretive plan and a vegetation management plan, you know, and all of these things. And it would have been glorious. And I would have loved to be a part of that process. And then there would have been money, and we would have built the whole damn thing. About now. But we didn't have that luxury. And so the public got to watch this. They got to watch us build this site. And much like watching a child grow up, they got to watch us learn to roll over and crawl and pull ourselves up and fall down a few times and eventually grow and mature. And they got to watch all of that while it's taken place over the last 20 years And they got to watch us adapt to different situations and different challenges and circumstances. And what's happened is we've gone from this is the original visitor center at Travelers Rest to this, to this, to this. Okay? Here's our trails in the early day. I'm running a mower. That's our trail. I'm out there with a lawnmower, cutting the grass to make the trail. Our interpretive signs are just propped up by benches because we don't want to dig in the ground out there because it's an archaeological site. And this is what our trails look like today with this interpretive plaza. And this site, the upper right in this photograph or in this slide is the same as the upper right in that slide. And then look at these interpretive signs. Guess what? It looks buried. It's not. We learned. We adapted. Our maintenance crew came up with these sign standards where they put together something that's built on a 3/4 inch steel base that then gets buried under gravel. So it's sitting right on top of the ground. It looks like it's buried, but it's not. And they're self-weathering steel, so it fits the historic nature of the site. Took us a long time to figure some of this stuff out, but we got there. And then I think about our programming. You know, in the early days, we hoped a few people would show up to hear what we had to say. And now we have this really vibrant, dynamic programming that goes on, and it's diverse. You know, we see this upper right-hand photo is Tim Ryan, who's a Sailors Tribal member, with a bunch of middle school kids, and they're building drying racks. That lower center picture was from a couple of years ago when Hassan Davis was out at the park with Trey, New York. And then the biggest thing that I think that we've done and become the hallmark and a little bit of the touchstone of the Travelers Rest experience is the education program that we offer every year. For over about 2,000 kids in about 20 different communities show up at Travelers Rest. And we have this curriculum-based education program that we're now into our second generation. We've been doing this thing long enough that parents who came to field trips there are now going to start bringing their kids out there. And that's how we stay relevant to the community as well, not just the Lolo community, but the Western Ontario community. And again, some of this was purposeful, and some of it was just serendipitous that we figured some of these things out. But one of our biggest concerns when I was there is what's going to happen when the bicentennials are? How badly are we going to lose visitation? How badly are we going to lose relevance? Well, here's a chart of visitation at Travelers Rest. That first peak is 2005. That's the bicentennial, the first year of the bicentennial Montana. There were about 25,000 visitors. And we did drop off a little bit after that. And then we leveled off. And then we started climbing. And the last 2 years have been over 60,000 visitors a year at Travelers Rest State Park. We're more than double what we peaked at in the bicentennial. And a lot of that is, we saw this pandemic spike, like a lot of people did, but it didn't go down. Because that spike was both residents and non-residents alike were discovering this stuff. Dan had mentioned that the National Trust for Historic Preservation was involved from very early on. And in 1999, Travelers Rest was listed as one of the 11 most endangered historic sites in the U.S. In 2017, to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the most endangered historic places list, they issued a list of the 11 success stories from their list in the past. It's humbling. Antietam, Angel Island, Little Rock Central School, President Lincoln College, Travelers Rest. There's, Dan talked about some of the people who are been so important to this, and I want to do a little bit of the same. There's a picture of Lewis Adams. Louis was one of the great folks who came and gave tirelessly his knowledge of Salish culture to us. I have to tell a little bit of a Louis story. He would come and do our storytelling series, and he'd drive up and he'd show up about 20 minutes ahead of time, and he'd sit in his car in the parking lot, and he'd pull out a piece of paper. Sometimes it'd be like a receipt out of his wallet, I think. You know, he'd have like a receipt from the grocery store. And he'd sit there and he'd scribble with a pencil on the back of that receipt. And those were his notes. And he'd get up and do an hour program, and about every 10 or 15 minutes, he'd pull out that receipt and look at the back of it for a minute, with his glasses perched down on the tip of his nose. And then he would go on. But Louis started just about every program with a quote from his grandmother, who was talking about the Salish people. And she told him, if it weren't for the good people, we wouldn't be here. And I have used that so many times in talking about travel dress. If it weren't for the good people, we would never have survived, and not only survived, but thrived into the 20 plus years we've been around. And the people are the lifeblood of that place. And what that's done is it's allowed us to keep that place alive and vibrant and changing. And it's a living testament to history. And I can't thank enough the people who have been involved in it from day one and continue to be part of that today. Thank you very much.
Sara, can we take a couple of questions? I know we're running a little long. 2 questions, says Sara. All right. Who do I see first? I'm going to go over here because you guys I know, so hold on. Let me run back here.
Simple question, when did you start redesigning for the new site?
Do you mean researching or?
Well, I was there at some point and all I saw was a field and it said Travelers Rest. So when did you start building all of the new infrastructure and signage?
We started building infrastructure in 2002. Continues to be today.
Okay, who's next? I'm going to give it to Scott because he raises his hand first. And he's on the other side of the room, so there he is.
Yell it out. More of a comment. Is Mary Ann easy here? Mary Ann, could you stand up, please? Mary Ann is the daughter of Tony Veazey, who in the 90s went to Dan Hall, and Dan said no. And after we lost Tony, Mary Ann has attended almost 100% of all chapter and Travelers Rest events for the last almost 30 years.
Oh, wow. Okay, I am gonna call it on Sara's behalf. I know people probably do have more questions, but you'll all be out at the park tomorrow for dinner, and if there's questions that we can answer there, that would be great. And I'm sure that we can get contact information if you have those specific questions for Sara, Dan, and Loren. So thank you again very much for being here today.